We We're going to begin shortly, so please find your way back to your seat for our 11:15 panel.
I invite everyone to please retake your seats for the 11:15 on the longest war. And for those that remain in the lobby, please remain quiet so that everyone in the audience can hear. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Drew Dornstadter. I'm an Army Major, Foreign Area Officer, a combat engineer, and a four-time veteran of our operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. As recipient of this year's Albright Scholarship Fund for Veterans, I'm grateful to the Aspen Institute for generously hosting me, and I'm delighted to introduce our next session, The Longest War. Now in its 16th year, the war in Afghanistan shows no signs of ending anytime soon. The Taliban are resurgent. Additional American ally and partner troops and aid provider deployments continue, and we continue expending significant resources, including the recent use of our arsenal's largest non-nuclear bomb. Meanwhile, Qaeda and ISIS remain active in the region, threatening the stability of both Pakistan and Afghanistan. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this session, Margaret Brennan. Margaret is the White House and Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent for CBS News. She's based in Washington and reports on the administration of President Trump for all CBS programs. In this role, she's reported on major national security stories, including nuclear negotiations with Iran, restoration of diplomatic ties with Cuba, the standoff with North Korea, the conflict in Ukraine, and the accord of transfer control of Syria's chemical weapons. Her reporting has taken her around the world with President Obama, as well as Secretaries of State Kerry and Clinton, and Defense Chiefs Hagel and Carter. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ms. Brennan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We've got a great panel here for you, and I want to go down the line and introduce them. Right next to me, Ambassador Raphel, former Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia with years of on-the-ground experience in Pakistan. Next to her, Ambassador Mohib, currently the ambassador to the U.S. from Afghanistan and a close aide to President Ghani, and Ambassador James Cunningham, the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan until about 2014. I want to point out that the ambassador from Pakistan was invited to participate but was unable to. So we, of course, can't talk about Afghanistan without talking about their neighbor, and that will be part of today's conversation. But I want to point that out, that we are going to be even-handed here. And I also want to recognize in the audience General Campbell, I believe is somewhere out here or will be shortly, America's top commander in Afghanistan until his retirement last year. So I know many of you are very informed on this topic, and hopefully we can follow up on some of the news. And Ambassador Mohib, I want to start with you. President Trump was presented with policy proposals for what to do in Afghanistan this week. We haven't heard if he's made any decisions, but he did say that basically he's grappling with the fundamental question of why the U.S. has been in Afghanistan for 17 years. When he was asked, is he going to send new troops, he said, we'll see. So you presumably have been talking to the administration, and you know what's being proposed and what your country's asking for. Can you tell us, what does Afghanistan need right now?
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I know there are several experts on Afghanistan present here. I'd like to start by thanking those veterans who served in Afghanistan. Without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. So thank you. On the policy question, first of all, we must address that there is a policy in place right now. It is not the new policy that we're waiting for, but we're in an ongoing fight with the Taliban and all of the terrorist groups that operate in Afghanistan. And the second about what is the question, what is America's plan, and what it is that it wants to do. I think it's important to ask, and it's important that it does get addressed. We are happy that there is so much deliberation over what it is that America wants and how it foresees this coming to a closure. What we have lacked in the past, and not necessarily a lack of policies, but a lack of a coherent policy that addressed both the geopolitical aspects and moving towards one direction. So departments had their own policies, not necessarily going in line with what we were all trying to achieve. Aid would deploy a different set of rules to what they thought the narrative or the policy was. DoD would have a different goal and agenda. The fact that they were complementary to one another was coincidental, because they addressed the same question, but it wasn't clearly laid out on what it is that America wants to get out of Afghanistan. And I think it's important to address that question for us, and it's important for the American people, because otherwise we can go on for a very long time without getting real results. And once we know the clearest form of what it is that America wants, we can also adjust our policies around that to ensure that our goals are aligned.
I've asked you your thoughts on the number of U.S. troops. That's often where the news coverage is and a lot of the political conversation in the U.S. is. And you said you wanted to address this, right? Because the question comes up, what would 3,900 U.S. troops, which is what the president has authorized Mattis to be able to deploy without coming back to him for further permissions, what does 3,900 do that 100,000 Americans could not?
Well, first of all, when we talk about troop numbers, we've already missed the point. Because what is it that we want to achieve, the important part, and then what do we need to address that, whether it's 3,900 troops, 3,800 troops. That's a more tactical decision, but I do want to address what it is that 39 or 4,000 troops can do that perhaps 150 could not. And it's clear in the results in the operations happening in Helmand and across Afghanistan right now. 300 Marines are making more difference than thousands of troops present in Helmand at a time, and they're doing it because the Afghan military is in the combat role. We didn't have an Afghan institution taking care of the war and be at the front line. The role that the U.S. is playing in that area now is more of an advise, assist, and in those clear capabilities that we lack from medevac, to air support and intelligence, and it leads while we build those critical skills, we need the support necessary, but the U.S. is not engaged, so is not engaged in the combat role out against the Taliban. There is a limited counterterrorism effort, but most of the burden is on the Afghan security forces, and that is why, with less, we can do more today.
Ambassador Cunningham, we really haven't heard from President Trump his thoughts on Afghanistan. As a candidate, it wasn't a topic that he spoke a lot about. As president, he really hasn't shared his thinking on this. If you were working in the Trump White House, how would you answer his question of why have we been there for 17 years and why should we be there now?
Well, first let me say I'm glad I'm not working in the Trump White House. As somebody said in an earlier session, there's a lot to be said for being a former ambassador or official. I think we need to answer that question, I think we need to take a step back and look at Afghanistan in context and look at the label, the title of this session, the longest war. The context for our engagement in Afghanistan is what happened on September 11. I was the acting U.S. representative to the United Nations on September 11. And so I saw firsthand what happened. And all of us who were there and who were thinking about this on September 12, we're already talking about how what had happened was going to drastically change the way we viewed security, the way we looked at our roles in the world, whether it was the United States or other partners, other countries, whether it was other international institutions. We all had sensed that this was a cataclysmic change in the way that we went about providing security to our people. And that has proved to be the case. But we tend to forget now when we're looking at a discrete example like Afghanistan that it is part of that bigger picture. So I would suggest the longest war, and by the way, it's not, Afghanistan has been at war for much longer than 16 years. The longest war that we need to address is not what's happening in Afghanistan, is really the longest. It is the conflict with terrorism and violent Islamist extremism, of which Afghanistan is one part. And that is the beginning of the answer, I think, to why we have been there for so long and why we should prepare ourselves and be willing to make the case to the American people and to the publics of our partners why we need a continued and sustainable ongoing engagement in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a critical part of the broader conflict that we've been talking about here for the last day and a half and will continue talking about. But nobody has hardly mentioned Afghanistan in that whole conversation. Yet it is one of the places where we are most engaged and where we still have an opportunity to succeed. And so what I would recommend to the President is that he support the kind of strategy that I understand is being presented to him, which will provide a way for stabilizing the security situation in the country. Those additional several thousand people, coupled with several thousand others from our other partners, will provide crucial abilities to train, advise, and assist at lower levels, closer to action in the field, that was taken away in many cases by the force levels that were set by President Obama as he was looking towards the end of his administration. And that security situation and that military effort needs to be set in the context of a focused strategy that engages countries in the region, engages all of our partners and all of our instruments of military, economic, and diplomatic power, and dedicates that to the task over time of preparing the groundwork for a peaceful solution to the conflict.
For those partners to be able to commit something, they need to hear from the U.S. first, many would say. Is that right?
That's entirely true. We are the leader of this effort, but it's important for Americans to remember and to realize that we are not alone in this effort. We have some 50 other nations engaged with us, as well as the entire spectrum of international institutions, from the UN to NATO to the World Bank to the EXIM Fund. They are all working with us together in partnership, trying to achieve our goals in this country. And we need to be mindful that they look to American leadership.
You're shaking your head, maybe? What
No,
are you
no,
disagreeing with?
No, I'm shaking my head. They're looking to American leadership, and I totally agree with that.
Is the right prism to look at this through, or perhaps to sell this to the President's national security team, which was the context for the question, I guess, through the idea that this has to be part of the war on terrorism?
Well, I think, first of all, let me associate myself with much of what Ambassador Cunningham has said, in the sense that we need to bear in mind how we got there in the first place.
Right.
And I think that's very clear, and we sometimes tend to lose sight of that. And another thing I'd like to respond to is Ambassador Mohib's suggestion that we don't really have a policy, or don't have our goals aren't clear. I think our goals have been clear from the beginning, to be fair to every administration that's been involved in this, that we want an independent, prosperous Afghanistan whose territorial integrity is respected, that has economic prosperity, connectivity to the north, to the east, to the west, and south, and so on. And very importantly to us, free from terrorist activity and any possibility of planning another attack on the U.S. homeland. So that's been clear. I think that it's very true that we've lost our way a little bit in terms of how to get there, and what steps are necessary, and what elements are necessary. And in that regard, my view has been for some time now that we've focused a bit too much on the military side, on the counterterrorism side, on the troop levels, and so on, and haven't looked enough at the political side of the problem there.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think we all have said, many people have said time and time again, there's no military solution here. I believe that's true, but I'm not sure that we've acted in accordance with that belief in putting the kind of focus on a political solution that we should have been doing.
What does a political solution mean to you? In the prior administration, it was getting to negotiations with the Taliban, having them recognize the existing constitution, including rights for women, all things that were on paper never became reality.
Right, and seemed beyond reach. I think in the first instance, it does mean finding a way to get the Taliban and other groups to the table, to talk with the Afghan government, and to not wait until the Afghan government has the tactical advantage on the battlefield. That would be nice, that would be ideal. I just think that can take too much time, and I think that time is not on our side here. The fact that this military struggle has been going on, that neither side has gotten the upper hand. I think neither side is going to get the upper hand over time continuously, so the time to start the political process is now.
Ambassador Mohib, what do you think of that? Because what we have heard from this administration is that they don't think anyone negotiates when they're winning, that the Taliban needs to be further brought to its knees to get to the negotiating table.
Well, we always talk about bringing the Taliban to the negotiation table without talking about what led them where they are, and what are the grievances that leads to the support for the Taliban in areas where they still enjoy some level of support. And if we don't address those grievances, we're not going to be able to do the negotiation that we all talk about so often. And those grievances are internal. I said we have not had a coherent policy and such. is because a lot of what we did undermined where we are today. It is America's longest war, and longer for us, close to 4 decades, is because we always try to use shortcuts to end. We try to empower strong men. We call them strong men today because the word warlord is no longer fancy. But we empowered them so that they could end the war. We gave them weapons and gave them contracts, made them richer. Today, they're the ones that are threatening the society. There is grievances, there is support for the Taliban because of that. In the past 2 years, in the past 3 years, President Ghani has done something very well, and that is to take ownership and be the commander-in-chief. And through that, counter Taliban's narrative. While they may have made some military gains, the Taliban, they have been losing their narrative, the war on narrative in Afghanistan, from the societies within. But we are not gaining. We're not gaining the sympathies that the Taliban have. That's going into a vacuum. We're not gaining it because we're not able to deliver, because we still are grappled with those solutions that were solutions in the past. Those temporary solutions that are become a permanent problem for us today. Mm-hmm. So if we are to address, we have to think about not just the geopolitical and the external elements, we have to think about what we are doing inside Afghanistan that would make it a stable, prosperous Afghanistan that we all want to see. But I also want to address another point, and that is to both the ambassadors mentioned that America went into Afghanistan because of its own national security interests. It continues to be in Afghanistan for its own national security interests. Today, we are fighting not just the Taliban, who may have just internal vision, which I disagree with. I think they think far beyond that. When you think of a soldier or one of their fighters, a Taliban fighter is no different to an Al-Qaeda fighter, to a Daesh fighter. They all have the same vision and goal. The leadership may have deviated versions of what they want to achieve and how they want to achieve it.
You think they're still unified, or you think they're divided?
I'm saying their goal is the same. It's whether their leadership is different and deviated in how they want to get there and what level of extremism they would tolerate is a different question. But what it is the point of trying to deal with all of the terrorists combined. In the 1990s, when the Soviets withdrew, the Afghan Mujahideen, who once again, a Hizb Islami Mujahid to a Jamiat Mujahid looked exactly the same. Their leadership had different opinions, ended up starting fighting internally. In many ways, it was a blessing in disguise for a lot of the international community, including the Arab world and everywhere else, where their fighters poured into Afghanistan to take part in the civil war. If Afghanistan collapses or explodes today, it would not remain within our borders. It was contained in the Afghan borders. In the age of technology and the instability that is already spread throughout the Middle East and many in the region, this war will become a global phenomenon. We need to end it, but we need to end it strategically with addressing the reasons for the conflict, not just killing or not just thinking about the external elements of it, both
right.
Internal and external.
And from my reporting, what I'd been told is the reason that this policy review has gone on for so long for the Trump administration is because it was sort of start and stop. Secretary Tillerson put the brakes on it, saying he wanted more of sort of what you're getting at, which is a broader regional approach, not just a military approach. It's what I've been told in the past. But what have you heard in terms of actual decision making? I mean, do you have any sense of what President Trump is willing to do?
Everything we have seen so far has been encouraging in the sense it's going in the right direction. I agree, we have a policy right now. Ambassador mentioned we're fighting the war. We're actually making tremendous gains against the Taliban. We just took Nawa district in Helmand. And in the last 6 weeks, we've managed to disrupt Taliban activities and offensive operations across Afghanistan. Close to 1,000 Taliban and Daesh fighters have been killed or captured.
But Secretary Mattis says we're not winning.
Well, if we want to, depending on where we want to get to, what we're trying, we need to have that cohesive policy and that need to address the difficult questions on what we're going to do with both external and internal elements. And what we are seeing so far is all promising and going in the right direction. The fact that funding to Pakistan has been reduced or put on hold, the fact that the appointments that were made that are working on Afghanistan, who know the country well, have all been promising in that regard. We're looking forward to seeing it as anxiously as you are, to see what the final strategy, what the final decision would be. But we certainly hope and will continue to work with our colleagues in the administration to ensure it is a cohesive policy that we can all get behind so that we can end this conflict once and for all, not just for us, for America, and for all our international partners. It is an international war against an international terrorist group. It's not just an Afghan war or just American war.
Very quickly, would your government be open to more contractors, and has your government been asked about this idea that has been floated within the White House of using more contractors along the line of what Eric Prince sketched out in his public editorial?
First of all, I know that the reason we're sitting here today is we're thinking about new solutions on what can be done, and it's absolutely reasonable for the administration to look for other solutions. But we must think about it in a context of what would work and what wouldn't. The American security forces, the American army, fights shoulder to shoulder with us against an army. That cannot be replaced. If there are complementary efforts along the advise and assist that goes along with what the main effort is, I think it may have some value. But if it is the main goal, I don't think it would work both culturally, and I don't think it would work with what we are all trying to achieve together, if that is the principal policy.
Open to it, but you prefer actual U.S. troops rather than hired guns?
Contractors don't win wars.
Okay. Ambassador Cunningham, what is your thought on that? I mean, this idea was circulated. This idea ended up being reported on. When the Trump administration is looking for new ideas, is that one that should be considered?
Well, as somebody who's been through various reviews like this in the course of my career, one should be open to new ideas. So it's natural, or I think it's to be welcomed that people, I hope within the administration as well as from outside, have come and presented some new thoughts about how one could better go about the job of implementing the strategy that's being developed. That said, the particular idea, at least as reported in the press, of using contractors to supplant or replace the use of military forces in the train, advise, and assist, and maybe other roles, I think is not a workable proposition for a whole variety of reasons. For time reasons, I won't go into it. But it wouldn't work, and it would actually tend to be counterproductive, I think, particularly culturally, when we have spent the last 16 years building a partnership between Americans and Afghans and between the American military and the Afghan military, which is a real thing, and as our military colleagues know and value. And you can't have that kind of relationship with a contractor/mercenary kind of arrangement. It wouldn't work, and it wouldn't be effective, quite apart from all the questions of political and other control that are involved.
The president did say to Secretary Mattis he has the ability to deploy up to 3,900 U.S. troops. After that point, he has to come back and ask for further consultations and permission. Why do you think Secretary Mattis hasn't deployed those troops yet?
I think I know Secretary Mattis. He's a very thoughtful, strategic person, and I'm sure that he wants to be sure that any decision that he takes, and it is a tactical decision, not a strategic decision, but it's a necessary one for reasons that I noted earlier. But I'm sure he wants to be sure that any decision that he takes is firmly embedded in the strategic approach that's being created, and he wants to avoid a kind of lack of synchronization between numbers, which are not the most important part of this equation, and the broader question of what it is that we are going to do as a government and as a coalition leader to focus the effort the way it needs to be focused. That's the real challenge now, is to how to focus The effort of the United States and our partners and the Afghan government, which obviously plays a crucial role, the Afghan political class play a crucial role in that. We need to marshal that effort now along the lines of effort that are being developed. And I assume that once that overall paradigm is in place, it will be very readily, he will be very readily able to address the numbers issue.
You spent so much time in Pakistan. You saw the headline today that the Pentagon has decided not to release the remaining reimbursements for military payments to Pakistan. That seems to be a bit of a warning shot here as this policy review goes on. It's a bit of pressure, at least, being exerted because Secretary Mattis said he can't certify that the Pakistanis are doing enough to crack down on the Haqqani network.
Right. This is something that's happened before. I'm sure it will happen again. And I think it is a warning shot. I mean, one of the things in reading the tea leaves in the news about this review is the perennial frustration with Pakistan and not being able to get the Pakistanis to crack down harder on the Haqqani network and others. And in that context, I'd like to return to something that Ambassador Mohib said, which is part of the issue is the grievances of the Taliban. And I would say it's not only the grievances of the Taliban, it's the grievances of many parts of the Afghan public, which gives the Taliban the influence that it has to have achieved territorial gains. They win some, they lose some, but it is those grievances which fuel the Taliban insurgency, and they do need to be dealt with. Pakistan as the sanctuary, as the place where the Haqqani network can recover, or from when in the past, certainly they've planned some of these attacks, are part of the problem. But I think it's important to realize that most of the problem still is internal to Afghanistan, and the issue of addressing the grievances of corruption and inability to deliver services and so on, and the grievance of many who don't like having foreign troops and so on and so forth inside Afghanistan. I think those things are all very real. And I think for us, we have to recognize that the face of the Afghan government, which we see in Kabul, hugely hardworking people, expatriates who've come back to serve their country, people like Ambassador Mohib, who was in Kabul and is now here, remarkable people. That isn't the face that you see in many parts of Afghanistan. And that's a part of the problem that needs to be grappled with. It's not just the external support.
Do you want to respond to that, Ambassador?
Well, I agree that there is, I mentioned the internal dynamic, and that's something that we must address. Reform is at the core of our government's agenda, and something we talked about at the breakfast too. We have to address the grievances of the people who end up providing or sanctuaries or support to the Taliban in the Afghan community, because they need to be reached. And diversification is extremely important in reaching those people and hearing their opinions. Many members of parliament, for example, are not representatives of the areas where there is conflict. And so what they feel about the conflict is not really what everybody else get to hear. We hear from people who are in safer areas, and I think that's what President Ghani has been focusing on, diversifying and bringing in more people from those areas so that we get to hear their voices too. And be able to address it.
But you agree that the Ghani government is under tremendous pressure right now.
Well, reforms is not easy. Again, these strong men have enjoyed impunity for such a long time. They're not going to give in easily to reforms. They were used to lots of carrots delivered by intelligence agencies, the Afghan government. All of those carrots have stopped. Those bags of cash have stopped. The contracts, the illegal contracts they were receiving to their companies, so their pocket is being hurt, which means they are going to challenge the reforms that are happening. But if we are committed to bringing a stability in Afghanistan, we must implement them and implement them decisively.
Just this week, there were a lot of headlines generated because the vice president of Afghanistan was not even able to land his plane in the country. He was turned away. And this is a vice president who has been living, some would say in exile in Turkey, some would say fled the country. But the point is many looked at that and said, quick take here, the Ghani government is imperiled in some way. It is not cohesive, and as the US government looks and questions how much support they want to give, that's something that might give them some pause. How do you respond?
No one's above the law. There are criminal charges that must be implemented, and the vice president is on a medical leave to Turkey, and when he returns,
That's
he's
how
more
you
than welcome.
characterize it.
He's more than welcome to come to Kabul, and will be dealt with by whatever the legal procedures there may be. But if we are to start making exceptions for people in higher positions, how are we ever going to address those grievances that Ambassador Raphel also talked about? Those people who see there are different rules for different political class and a different rule applied to those in the rural areas and then held to a different standard.
Ambassador Cunningham, you were on the ground for so long. You've seen so many of these problems for so long. It doesn't seem like there are necessarily a different set of leverage points now for the Trump administration. How do you approach all these problems that in many ways have been chewed on for 16 years or more in a different way?
Well, they haven't really been chewed on for 16 years. They've been chewed on in various ways and methods at various periods during those 16 years. And that's another important thing to realize. We haven't been through one constant effort for 16 years, either politically or militarily. We had the first very successful phase, which was the ejection of the Taliban and the creation of the new political structure in Afghanistan. That was very successful exercise of American international diplomacy and Afghan responsibility. We had a second phase, which I would call kind of benign neglect, where we Americans kind of weren't paying much attention to what was going on. Things were drifting along in Afghanistan. We had a third phase then of Taliban resurgence. We had at least a fourth phase of kind of react to that at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Obama administration, with the surge to try to push the Taliban back. And one thing I also want to mention is in that phase and subsequently, the military aim was not, our military aim was not to defeat the Taliban. That was not a task that we thought was possible, especially since the Taliban enjoyed and continue to enjoy sanctuary in Pakistan. The purpose of the surge in the military effort was to push back the Taliban from key areas and to help create time and space for the Afghans themselves to take over the security responsibility, which they did at the end of 2014. The problem with and then we had the follow-on period of strategy, which was supposed to be train, advise, and assist. The problem with that latter phase was twofold. The timeline was unrealistic. The timeline for international withdrawal was unrealistic. We thought we could produce more capacity and more results in the Afghan security forces than proved to be possible, particularly in key areas like intelligence and air support and logistics, particularly the Air Force.
This is all during the Obama administration.
Yes. And then the fact that we had announced a withdrawal deadline quite apart from any conditions that existed in the security realm undermined all the efforts to generate pressure for a political settlement, because nobody was going to commit to a political settlement, either Afghanistan's neighbors or the Taliban or anybody else, knowing that the Americans were leaving. So they were all going to wait and see what happened and see if they could press their advantage after the combat role of the US forces ended, which in fact is exactly what happened. So we're now actually in a next phase with this new administration, with the new strategy review, and this administration has a great opportunity to correct some of those past mistakes and to help right the course and regenerate the effort to encourage the Afghans to step up to their responsibilities, which is absolutely essential. This is, after all, essentially an Afghan problem, and it's an Afghan responsibility, and to reset the stage for a process supported by an ongoing American international engagement that will finally start to press the Taliban and their sponsors to come to the negotiating table. So that, I think, is where we are now if the administration review comes out in the right place.
Robin, Senator John McCain, who I know we've all been thinking about a lot in the past few days, spent his 4th of July in Afghanistan along with Senators Graham and Warren. He stood there and said, frankly, he thinks the Trump administration's approach here is unnerving. He really called Secretary Mattis to task here when he had him before Congress, saying, if you don't come up with a strategy, I'm going to give you one. And asked basically, where's the State Department and why hasn't the Secretary of State gone to Kabul yet? So given his description of the landscape and the decisions that need to be made now, what are you thinking?
Well, I think part of the difficulty is, and part of the exasperation on the part of Senator McCain, is that we're, sort of makes my point. Time is a wasting here. The criticism is that the administration didn't get a plan in place sooner, didn't get people in place, didn't empower the State Department, didn't have a new ambassador in place. They've now named someone who's a career professional, very good choice. But I think he saw things sort of the water going into the sand. And I think, you know, I myself share that frustration. He subsequently went to Pakistan and, you know, made his usual you know, representations to the Pakistanis, as we all do, you know, that they needed to do more to support this process and to stop supporting the Haqqanis. But I think what he heard there from the Pakistanis, and obviously I wasn't party to the conversations at all, but from what I hear to talking to people on the Pakistani side, is that they too are waiting for an overall policy. And that part of the reason they're unwilling to accelerate any effort to dismantle the Haqqani network as we've requested is that they see, when they look, that everybody's got proxies in Afghanistan. The Iranians do, the Russians do, you know, I don't know about the Chinese, but everybody's got proxies, and they're not about to give up theirs.
They see the Haqqanis as an asset.
They see the Haqqanis as an asset, which, and they may not have explicitly said this, but you know, I've always sensed this as their view, which they cannot give up in terms of their own national security interests until a clearer picture evolves. And for them, a clearer picture is the kind of Afghanistan that we all want. You know, but they aren't going to, they're going to continue to hedge their bets.
If I could just add, the dilemma has plagued us for at least the last 10 years of how to deal with Pakistan's role in this, and it's still encapsulated just in the last 2 days when the State Department issued its country report on terrorism, where in the section on Pakistan, it said that the Taliban and Haqqanis and others continue to enjoy safe haven in Pakistan. And almost in the same next paragraph, it said Pakistan is an important partner in counterterrorism. We have to break through that Gordian knot somehow.
But why is it in that same graph? Is it because we so badly need Pakistani help that you can't really put pressure on them?
It's because there actually is a positive role that Pakistan occasionally plays.
With Al-Qaeda and
just not others. In the area where we need them to play it vis-a-vis Afghanistan. But Pakistanis have suffered terribly dealing with their own internal terrorism problem. There's no doubt about that. And they have supported us at various times in some things I won't go into. But the underlying dilemma is it is going to be almost impossible to get the Taliban to the negotiating table and to bring the conflict to an end as long as they continue to be able to live and plan and operate from Pakistan. That's unfortunately the reality that has proven out over the past years, What we have tried to do is find a way to straddle that fence and convince the Pakistanis that what they were doing was against their own interest, which they finally paid lip service to, but they haven't actually done anything about it. And we need to find a way to get them to do something about it. And that is also an important opportunity for this new administration. And it's a shame that it is taking them so long to get their act together to do this.
Ambassador Mohib, I know you want to.
I know, I
ban.
have to. We're very self-critical when it
Let
comes
me just
to
say,
the
I'm
Afghan government.
very sorry the Pakistani ambassador isn't here to be able to answer this.
I was going to say just that. I tried to focus on the internal matters. The Pakistani ambassador pulled out of this talk, and I'm going to say something that I've said to him in another panel. So I know that there is fairness in their response. Pakistan has not done, I think this is delusional to think that Pakistan is a critical partner in against terrorism. Pakistan is moving towards becoming a state that supports terrorism as an element of foreign policy to a state that believes in terrorism. The new cadre of officers that are coming to the lead in Pakistani military are the graduates of Dawa school built by Ziaul Haq at the time, and strongly believe in extremism as as an ideology, not as this generation who has perhaps their own anxieties with India and are using this as a foreign policy tool. If we continue to give Pakistan a free pass, imagine the conflict and the tremendous of the conflict would be at the time when it's going to have a military that's 1 million strong, has nuclear weapons, has sophisticated intelligence, and believes in extremism at its core. So dealing with Pakistan's military is extremely important. I think we need to be working with Pakistan's civilian government and doing everything we can in terms of sanctions on Pakistan's military, weapons sales to Pakistan, putting Pakistani military leaders on the watch list.
This is what
for
you're
their
asking
travel.
the Trump administration to do?
I think this is what the world needs to do. Anything given to the Pakistanis today, whether it's weapons or finances, will be used against the entire global world order. They're breaking the world order for its terrorism, its support for proxies. It's not the use of other countries and their proxies. We're breaking what is a global order where we have multinational institutions that deal with conflicts between states, such as the UN and others, are all falling apart because we're ignoring Pakistan's use of proxies. How can we then go to other countries and say, don't use proxies for your war? This is becoming a new global order. And Pakistan is a major threat to not just to us, to your security. Treating it as a partner, I think, is a mistake. And treating a partner in counterterrorism is a mistake. I think terrorism and Pakistan can be equated.
I do want to get to questions next, but
I just had a couple points that I wanted to make. First of all, in response to something that Ambassador Cunningham said on the need to get the Taliban to the table and to put more pressure on them before they'll come to the table. I'm not persuaded that they're not ready to come to the table. I think that's a two-sided problem. Everybody's waiting to get more advantage. I think the Afghan government has also been reluctant to come to the table before they have a greater military advantage. And I think the United States has been very ambivalent at various points about engaging with the Taliban. So that, that's not entirely clear.
If there is a Taliban to engage with, that's centralized or unified. Yeah. That's the other.
Yes, and that is an issue. And the other thing I would say about the Pakistani military that I think is a little bit misleading about what Ambassador Mohib said. When I talk to my military counterparts, both in the US and Pakistan, there is a growing realization that, in fact, the new and upcoming generation of the officer corps is much more sensitive to the whole problem of terrorism internally in Pakistan, because they're the ones who've had 1, 2, 3, 4 deployments in the federally administered tribal area, and have taken part in Pakistan's effort to quash their own internal terrorism problem. So I'm not sure that's
Internally,
accurate.
yes. But
I'm not sure
Pakistan
that's
has
accurate.
always played a dual role when it comes to terrorists. The good and bad terrorist concept comes from Pakistan, where it believes it's only bad when it's internal. So yes, maybe they take the internal one
I'm just
seriously.
saying ideologically and so on, that stress I think is a bit inaccurate.
I want to get to some questions from the audience here. Here on the right side, can we give the microphone to Elise Lavitt there from CNN?
Thank you for the discussion. I mean, I think there's so much discussion about the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan, and we don't look enough not only about Pakistan, but other countries that are increasingly becoming actors in Afghanistan. I was wondering if you could expand on that, and particularly reports of increased Russian support for the Taliban, and how the impact of other actors in Afghanistan beyond the U.S. As a force for good, and as you say, Pakistan as a negative force. Thank you.
Ambassador Mohib, do you want to share what you've told U.S. officials about Russian support?
Let's talk about what it is that brings terrorists to Afghanistan to fight, and is the enabling environment where all we see, or many outside think that the Taliban is an internal issue, an internal problem. They don't have aspirations beyond Afghanistan. But they provide the enabling environment for the 11,000 foreign troops, foreign fighters that are currently using their platform to bring instability in Afghanistan, but also to challenge the assets of other countries that they actually have their problems with. The ATIM doesn't have a problem with Afghanistan, or for us to be able to reconcile in any way. It's a problem for China. It's the same for IMU and all of the other terrorist groups that have international aspirations. I think this is where we have to bring global support, and what we are hoping that the strategy will take into account is, what do we do with geopolitical aspirations of those terrorist groups? We talk about reconciliation of the Taliban, but even when it comes to the Taliban, we have to dissect how many of them are actually political, and how many of them are criminals and terrorists in their ideology. So what we do is talk about how we address all of those issues. And we recently held a session in Kabul, what we call the Kabul process, where all of those regional countries were brought on board to talk exactly about how do we deal with terrorism as a threat to us all. And a threat that is beyond our borders, may be contained within because of the enabling environment, but will definitely spill over if this was to fail, if the efforts to bring them to a close were to fail.
But how would you describe Russian involvement?
Well, again, terrorism is terrorism, and I think all our countries need to be able to take that into their own account and how they deal with it. We think the best approach is to deal with the Afghan security forces, the Afghan government, supporting non-state elements, supporting non-state actors is not in the interest of any country. We're discouraging Pakistan to do so, and every other country that think that perhaps non-state actors would be a solution to their problems or their way in Afghanistan.
But the public testimony from U.S. officials regarding Russian support for the Taliban, what is the Afghan government's view on that? That's what the police was getting at.
The Russians share with us that they're concerned about Daesh, and perhaps that this may be an element. But we have proof that in places where they don't have territorial conflict with one another or resource fight, Daesh and Taliban cooperate, especially in the north where the IMU is a Daesh affiliate. They would not be able to operate without Taliban's support and network. So it would be a mistake to consider the Taliban as part of any kind of solution in bringing this conflict to a closure. Non-state actors are not the way to go.
Another question here. Can we bring the mic to Morgan Ortegas there?
Thanks, Margaret. For the panelists, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of soft power as we pursue a new strategy in Afghanistan with this administration. I've gotten to know the ambassador through my support of the American University of Afghanistan, and just being there in March, I'm amazed at the resiliency of these young students in Afghanistan and how much they want to get an education and change their country. Of course, funding for the American University and other institutions is at risk in Afghanistan, so would love your thoughts on the importance of soft power as we develop this new strategy.
Can I address that?
Sure.
I don't like the term soft power, but it is a useful label, so I guess we'll use that. Afghanistan, as any conflict zone, any complex zone, there aren't military answers to many of the problems that exist, and there's certainly no military answer to a long-term positive future for Afghanistan. We have to figure out how to bring to bear and how to maintain America's own diplomatic, development assistance, economic development, all those instruments that are normally labeled soft power. That's where the real answer lies over time, including creating the positive conditions to encourage Afghans to believe in and to support and develop their own system, as well as dissuading people from supporting or acquiescing in the activities of terrorism. There won't be any ability to implement a new strategy, the kind of strategy that is under consideration, if we don't have the diplomatic and soft power elements available to us and to our international partners to bring to bear. That's just a fact of life. And if one tries to pursue such a strategy without those instruments, it will soon become apparent, I predict, that that won't work. So we should start, I hope, the administration will come to see and will start from the premise that we can't find a solution to this conflict or to the broader conflict with violent Islamist extremism without the strongest possible use of of our diplomatic instruments and the incredible expertise and professionalism that we have available to us.
Ambassador Mohib, have you convinced the administration not to cut funding to those kind of programs as they look at cutting other forms of foreign aid?
I'd say to the soft power part is, while we're fighting a conflict, we have to look beyond it. We had a breakfast that focused on some of these issues, and I mentioned something more personal to me, and that was I grew up under the Soviet occupation. I was a refugee, and during being a refugee, there were schools for us, and a small amount of money was also allocated to the development of a curriculum that helped refugee students like me go to school and learn English, but of course basic skills in life that prepared us for the future. Efforts like the American University are in similar fashion preparing us for beyond this conflict when we end. The Afghan robotics team that many of you have probably heard about are a group of six girls from between the ages of 14 and 16 were here to compete in a competition with their peers from across the developed world, and how do they sort what would be a contaminated water, but in this case balls, of the same robot that was sent across. They show the kind of progress we have made over the past 16 years, uninterrupted support to education, healthcare, and the freedom of speech. All of that put together is the result that we saw in these girls coming here to show that we have a positive element to it. I know we focus on security. It's obviously very close to my heart. We had 75,000 casualties in the past 2 years. So excuse me if I get emotional when we talk about Pakistan wanting to end terrorism and are committed to it. That speaks the opposite. We have the carrying of the coffins is extremely heavy on our shoulders. And we are committed to ending it, but we are also committed to making sure that we have a future beyond the conflict. And that would come when we have continued support to elements like that: education, healthcare, media, free media, and the exposure to technology and the rest of the international the world.
You have another question? Here in the middle. Sorry, we're getting you a mic there. You could speak into it.
Huda Faruqi from Washington and Aspen. I'd like to, first of all, thank the woman who spoke about the American University of Afghanistan. And I'd like to tell you that American University of Afghanistan continues to get dramatic and significant support from the U.S. government. And most recently, in the last 3-4 months, as much as $20 million alone to enhance security for the campus. And I'd also like to thank the panel members for this great and stimulating presentation that was made today. But I would like to go beyond, get back to Pakistan and go beyond the Haqqani network and the support. And does Pakistan really want Afghanistan to succeed? What are the panel's thoughts on that? And I'm talking about success, overall success, Afghanistan becoming the kind of Afghanistan that we all want it to be. Does Pakistan want this to happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have the ambassador to speak for his government, but given your experience here, do you want to answer the
exactly.
question?
I wouldn't pretend to speak for them. But my view is, having talked to Pakistanis about this over the years, many, many years, the answer is obviously yes. An unstable Afghanistan, from their point of view, is very dangerous for them. I mean, that's sort of common sense. The difficulty for them is they are, for what I have heard them say, they are very concerned that without, movement on the political side, more promise for stability, that Afghanistan could break apart. They're worried about the worst case scenario, which is why they maintain their assets. And so I'd just like to make another point about soft power, really taking advantage of what the international community has to offer beyond the wonderful Kabul University and various things that have happened more in the urban areas and the rural areas. You really have to decrease the level of violence. And that's why I tend to keep repeating and repeating, you need to get a political dialogue going now, because it's going to take a long time. But in order to decrease the violence and allow Afghanistan to finally really take off, you've got to have a political solution.
I'd like to say no. An unstable Afghanistan is in favor of Pakistan the only kind of stable Afghanistan would be one that plays to Pakistan's tune. Otherwise, any other kind of Afghanistan is better than that to them. So unstable one would be there.
We have time for one very quick question. If I could just ask you to be very brief in, there you go.
I address my question to the ambassador. What are the detailed programs that the Afghan government has to address the grievances in the rural area? That is, I know you have limited resources, but what are you actually doing to try to address these grievances to wean people away from the Taliban?
Well, first of all, the society, there is a big grassroots effort that's happening naturally against the Taliban's narrative, largely because the Taliban have committed several spectacular incidents that led to the deconstruct of their narrative. One, their argument was they're fighting an invading force. They increased their level of violence in areas where there were no foreign troops left. They started targeting mosques. They started targeting civilians across Afghanistan, which has started to deconstruct their own narrative and weed away any sympathies for them in their areas, former stronghold. The Asia Foundation survey last year showed that even in Kandahar, sympathies for the Taliban went down from 60% to 22%. They have started killing of religious scholars who are countering their narrative. These are, last month they assassinated someone, Dr. Pirose, who is a religious scholar who translated Sahih Bukhari. It's a volume of the Prophet saying hadith. After the Quran, it's considered one of the most respected book in Islam, from Arabic to Pashto, so that people will know what it is that the Islam actually says rather than what's being told to them. and people like that are being targeted and assassinated. What we're doing is to ensure that those areas where those sympathies are dropping is coming to Afghanistan, and that's increasing the rule of law and making sure that we end the culture of impunity throughout the country. We have started reforms at our judiciary sector, again, faced with very fierce resistance from strong people who have strong influence in the country, but we're reforming the judiciary, we reformed the security sector, we worked on the Ministry of Defense and are working our way to the Ministry of Interior. So the police, the first point of contact would be, and so when it comes to the representation, we're working on a more reformed election system so that when representatives are chosen, they are equally representing the country and have the opinions brought to the national level. But more importantly, deliver services in areas within the customs that is acceptable to them and within our own means. You said you put your finger on the matter that our resources are limited. So we must work with what is culturally acceptable. We're expanding on one of our development programs that is in rural area, that was in rural development, where the communities participate in what kind of development they want in their areas. Democratically select, and the government delivers. We're expanding that program to additional services, not just rural development efforts, but also judiciary services, the basics of governance, so that the community is an equal partner to the government in making sure that we build the kind of Afghanistan where those grievances are addressed.
All right, we have to leave it there. I think we're a little bit over time. Thank you for all of your time. Thank you. So all the ambassadors here on your panel.